Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent a lot of time talking about the effects of quantum mechanics, probabilities, energy levels, all that strange particle behavior. But today, well, we're kind of shifting gears, moving from the what happens to the how we calculate it.
Right, we're getting into the engine room, so to speak.
Exactly. We are hitting the mathematical core, the language that lets physicists calculate, well, any quantum event, anywhere, generally, elegantly.
That's a great way to put it. Our source material today, Chapter 20, Operators, it really is a key turning point.
How so?
Well, up to now, we've often dealt with these long lists of complex numbers, the amplitudes, right?
Yeah.
To define a state.
Yeah, very cumbersome.
Totally. And it becomes algebraically just impossible very fast when you're dealing with complex general systems. So this chapter introduces the language of linear algebra. Think vectors, matrices, but more abstract.
Replacing those clunky lists with abstract symbols.
Exactly. Symbols and powerful rules that make writing quantum equations much, much simpler and more general.
Okay, so our mission seems clear then. We need to learn this new vocabulary. What is an operator? How does it connect to stuff you can actually, measure in a lab? And maybe most importantly, how does this abstract mass suddenly show us that quantum mechanics actually contains classical physics?
That's the goal. We're going deep into the structure following Feynman's logic.
All right, let's start at the beginning. The foundation, state vectors.
Right. So we represent a physical state using this abstract symbol, the ket symbol. That's the state vector.
Don't think of it as numbers yet.
Not primarily. Think of it like a single thing, an object in a conceptual space. It holds all the information.
But it can be broken down.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If we need to, we can always express I wrangle as a sum, a linear combination of simpler known base states, say I wrangle, like I wrangle sum like Hempel. Those seaters are the complex amplitudes we talked about before.
Got it. So the state vector is what's the operator?
The operator is the do. It's the action. We write it with a little hat. It's basically an instruction. You perform this operation on a state, and it transforms it into a new state. Let's call it finable.
So like a function, but for states.
Pretty much. Algebraically, we just write finable. It takes one state vector and maps it to another, a state transformer.
Okay, that makes sense abstractly. But, how do we connect that to measurement? If finable is just a math rule, how do we know it corresponds to energy or position or something real?
That's the crucial link. This is where the math meets physical reality. And it requires a really important constraint on the operator.
Okay.
If an operator, let's call it, again, is going to represent something you can actually measure, a physical quantity, it must have a special property. It needs to be self-adjoint. You'll also hear the term Hermitian.
Self-adjoint or Hermitian. Okay. And what does that mathematical property actually guarantee for us physically?
Two absolutely critical things. First, it guarantees that any measurement result you get from using that operator, say, an energy value will always be a real number.
Which is good because lab equipment doesn't usually read complex numbers.
Right. Pretty vital. You can't measure 5 + 3i joules. But second, and this is deeper, this Hermitian property means the operator is the observable, in a sense.
How do you mean is the observable?
In quantum mechanics, we don't just calculate a physical quantity using some formula. The operator itself embodies the very act of measuring that quantity. The operator itself embodies the very act of measuring that quantity. It's the mathematical representation of measure A.
Wow. So if it's not Hermitian,
then it doesn't correspond to any possible measurement in our universe. It's just a mathematical operation without a direct physical counterpart we can observe.
that's a really sharp distinction. The math isn't just describing reality, it's prescribing what's measurable. Okay, so we have this abstract language. Operators need to be Hermitian to be physical. The next step is calculation, right? Let's take an example. An atom in some complicated state, not a definite energy state. How do we figure out its average energy?
Right. The sort of standard way, the intuitive way, is statistical.
Like probabilities.
Exactly. If your state Cyrangle is a mix, a superposition of different energy-based states, say Cyrangle with energies at 2 nulls, when you measure the energy, you won't get one answer every time.
You get a distribution.
You get a statistical distribution.
Yeah.
So you calculate the probability, Papel, of getting each energy $8. That probability is just the square of the amplitude, Langle, Cyrangle, $2.
Yep.
Then you just do the standard statistical average. Sum up each possible energy 8 times its probability, pay or tie ability.
That makes sense, but it sounds like, well, potentially a lot of work. still dealing with potentially infinite lists of amplitudes and energies.
It can be. And this is where the operator formalism really shows its power. It gives us the ultimate shortcut. After you work through the algebra, it all collapses down to one incredibly elegant, universally applicable equation.
For the average value of any physical observable operator.
Any Hermitian operator, yes. We call this the expectation value, often written Langle or Wrangle.
This is that famous sandwich equation.
That's the one. Langle or Wrangle is given by the expression Langle-Langle-Hangle.
Okay, break that down. Langle-Hangle's the bra, Yangle is the ket.
Right. Think of the state vector wrangle and its complex conjugate partner, the bra vector Langle-Della, as forming a wrapper, or a sandwich, around the operator.
And what does that sandwich do?
It calculates how much of the the physical quantity represented by Hangle is contained within the state Nangle-Wrangle on average. It projects out the average value. This formula, Langle-Hangle, is really the central tool for getting numbers, measurable results, out of the abstract quantum state.
That is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
And it works no matter what base states we might be thinking about.
Doesn't matter. It's completely general.
Okay, but now we need to connect this abstract stuff, the bras, pockets, operators, back to the world many people work in, the coordinate system, wave functions.
Right. How do we translate this abstract operator into something we can actually compute using calculus, derivatives, integrals?
Yeah.
It's a shift in perspective. The abstract vector space is where the fundamental rules live. The coordinate space, using wave functions like Pallas-Azadi, is where we often do the specific number crunching.
So how does the sandwich change?
When we move to wave functions, the bracket notation Langle-Hadze becomes a definite integral, usually something like theta ajgxz, where theta is the complex conjugate of the wave function.
And how there is the operator acting on the function.
Exactly. It's the operator expressed in the coordinate representation, often involving derivatives.
Let's make that concrete. Talk about the specific operators. Energy first. The Hamiltonian. We use hat sometimes.
Right. The Hamiltonian operator, Hapiter, often written with the script h in coordinate space to distinguish it from the abstract hat, represents the total energy of the system, kinetic plus potential.
In the abstract picture, it's just hat acting on Abinus-way.
Correct. But in the coordinate world, using wave functions, HATPA becomes a very specific set of instructions involving derivatives. For a simple 1D case, it typically involves a term like frac2 dx2 for kinetic energy, plus the potential energy function Vx all.
So the second derivative with respect to position handles kinetic energy.
Yes. And the key idea is this. The abstract operator, how it is the general concept, find the energy, while the differential operator is the specific calculus command you use when working with wave functions.
Okay. Now let's apply that coordinate transformation idea to the two most basic observables, position and momentum. Position seems like it should be simple.
It is surprisingly simple. The position operator in the coordinate world, let's call it HAL, is just multiply by x.
That's it?
That's it. That's what we call a multiplicative operator. If you want the average position, Langle x Wrangle, you calculate the integral of tie x xe x by e, which simplifies to integrating $6 times e.
Which is just position times the probability density. Makes sense. Very intuitive.
Very. But momentum hell is where things get really, really quantum. It breaks that simple multiplication pattern.
It's not just multiply by p.
Definitely not. And this is, a core feature of quantum mechanics showing up right here in the math. Momentum involves change, motion.
So it needs a derivative.
It needs a derivative. The momentum operator in the x direction in coordinate space, hat Lx, is defined as frac partial x10.
Okay, so Planck's constant over $1 times the partial derivative with respect to x. Why? Why does momentum get a derivative while position just gets multiplication? What's the deep physical reason for that difference?
Well, think about what a derivative measures. It measures rate of change. In physics, derivatives are fundamentally tied to motion, to change, and especially to wave behavior.
Like,
when the momentum operator acts on a wave function, let us study play, it's essentially extracting information about how rapidly the phase of the wave is changing in space. It's probing the waveness, the spatial frequency.
so position just cares where the wave is significant, but momentum cares about its internal structure, how it's oscillating.
Exactly. Position is about location, momentum is about the wave's propagation characteristics. That need for a derivative is what encodes the wave nature of matter into the momentum observable. It's fundamentally quantum.
And we see this kind of derivative-based approach carry over when we look at things like angular momentum, right? Which
Right.
classically involves position and momentum.
Absolutely. You take the classical definition, like for the z component, log z equals x by pxu. Then you substitute in the operators. For sixers, you use multiply by x. For big severs, you use phi partial partial, and so on.
So you build the angular momentum operator, had a CL, out of the position and momentum operators.
Precisely. And that resulting differential operator lets us calculate things like the quantization of spin and orbital angular momentum, which are purely quantum effects.
Okay, this differential nature of momentum, Hack partial Angus male, leads us directly to probably the most famous non-classical idea in this whole chapter, commutation, or rather non-commutation.
Right. This is fundamental.
In our everyday classical world, measuring where something is and then measuring how fast it's going is the same as measuring how fast it's going and then measuring where it is. The order doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter at all. You measure x, then p, you get the same info as measuring p, then x.
But in quantum mechanics,
The order matters intensely. Applying the position operator for s and then the momentum operator type of text gives a different result than applying a hats first and then hats.
why? Does the first measurement disturb the system?
That's the physical intuition, yes. The act of measuring one quantity inherently disturbs the value of the other in a way you can't avoid. Mathematically, we express this by looking at the commutator.
The commutator, defined as...
For two operators, the commutator is written hati-tot, and it just means hati-tot. It measures the difference caused by switching the order.
And for position and momentum, this difference is not zero.
It is definitely not zero.
Okay.
This is one of the cornerstone results. The commutator of hati-tot is hati-tots.
And what does that equal? What's the magic non-zero value?
It equals high-talk.
Imaginary unit times the reduced Planck constant bar.
That's it. This simple-looking equation is, in essence, the mathematical statement of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Wow. Okay, so the fact that these operators, these mathematical representations of measurement, don't commute, that's why there's a fundamental limit to how precisely we can know both position and momentum simultaneously.
Exactly. The non-zero commutator, specifically the presence of Lie-bar in it, quantifies that inescapable uncertainty. It's not just a limitation of our instruments. It's baked into the fundamental structure of reality as described by these operators.
The map dictates the physical limit.
It does, and we see the same non-commuting pattern show up elsewhere, for instance, with the components of angular momentum.
Like Haut-bar and Haut-bar.
Right, they don't commute either. Their commutator, Haut-bar, turns out to be A-bar, Haut-bar.
So measuring psi-bar affects what you can know about the other bars.
Precisely. You can know the angular momentum component perfectly along one axis, say z, but that inherently introduces uncertainty in the components along the other axes, x and y. These commutation rules govern how rotations and angular momentum behave in all quantum systems, from electrons to molecules.
Okay, this is making sense. We have states, operators acting on them, the Hermitian property for observables, the sandwich formula for averages, and now non-commutation encoding uncertainty. Let's tie it all together with the last piece, time evolution.
Right, section 20 to 7.
If we have some quantum state, maybe complex, evolving in time, how does a measurable quantity, like the average position, change over time? This feels like where quantum mechanics really needs to prove it connects back to the world we know.
Yes, this is where everything connects beautifully.
Yeah.
We ask, what is the rate of change of the average value of some observable behave?
Okay.
The derivation leads to another fundamental equation. The rate of change turns out to depend on the commutator of that operator with the Hamiltonian operator, the total energy operator.
So Frankel involves the length.
Essentially, yes. The exact formula is fracas, wrangle, tha, plus a term if how itself explicitly depends on time, which often it doesn't for basic quantities.
Okay, that's the general quantum rule for how averages evolve. Now, the amazing part is applying this to classical quantities, right? Like position had and momentum had.
This is the payoff. This is where we see if this abstract quantum framework reproduces classical physics, at least for average values.
So what happens when we plug in had and hat?
We need the commutator. When you calculate that using the typical Hamiltonian kinetic T plus potential V, you find it's proportional to the momentum operator.
Okay.
So the equation tells us that the rate of change of the average position, frac ring, is directly proportional to the average momentum Langle px ring. Specifically, it's Langle px Wrangle phi m.
Wait, rate of change of position is average momentum over mass. That's average velocity.
That's exactly the quantum statement of velocity, emerging directly from the operator algebra and the time evolution rule.
Okay, that's one down. Now, what about momentum? What happens when we plug Hase in for haching?
Right.
Right.
Right. Calculating that commutator gives something proportional to the derivative of the potential energy, that Schrack
Which is the force.
which is the force,
Yes.
Feckeckel. So the equation becomes the rate of change of the average momentum, px Wrangle, is equal to the average value of the force.
This is Newton's second law.
That's Newton's second law. $5 is dp/dt, but expressed for the quantum averages.
Exactly. This is the proof right here in the math. The fundamental quantum laws governing the time evolution of operators when applied to the average values of position and momentum reproduce precisely the classical laws of motion described by Newton.
So quantum mechanics doesn't just approximate classical mechanics, it contains it, at least in terms of these average behaviors. It contains it perfectly. The fact that this abstract operator formalism leads back to Newton's laws for average quantities is, well, a stunning validation of the whole quantum theory.
That really is an incredible journey. We started with these abstract state vectors, Tan Rangelmau, defined operators as the mathematical tools that act on them, transforming states or representing measurements if they're Hermitian.
Right.
Use the fundamental formula Idwell, Ilangle, Irangle to calculate the average or expectation value of any observable.
The workhorse equation.
Applied this to specific operators like position hatch, just multiply by x, and momentum involves frag partial.
The key difference there.
Found their non-commutation had I bar, which is the root of the uncertainty principle.
The quantum signature.
And finally, showed that the time evolution of these quantum averages perfectly matches Newton's classical laws.
It's a complete, self-consistent picture. And I think the most profound takeaway, for me at least, is how the mathematical structure itself mirrors physical reality.
Absolutely.
The fact that operators need to be Hermitian tells us what's physically measurable. And the fact that certain operators don't commute isn't just some mathematical oddity. It reflects deep physical truths about the limits of simultaneous measurement. It shapes the world.
And seeing the quantum averages obey classical laws is just, well, it seals the deal. It shows this isn't just some weird theory. It's the deeper theory underneath the classical world we see.
Precisely.
Okay, so that leads us perfectly into our final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. We found that the fundamental commutator, the one between position and momentum, is equal to I bar. That Planck's constant seems to be the key that unlocks all the quantum weirdness.
It really is the quantum parameter.
So what would the world actually look like if, somehow, Planck's constant para were exactly zero?
Well, if Dabar was 0, then that commutator would become 1 times 0, which is just 0.
They would commute.
Position and momentum would commute. The order of a measurement wouldn't matter anymore.
Meaning no uncertainty principle.
No uncertainty principle. You could know position and momentum perfectly, simultaneously. The wave nature associated with momentum, tied up in that Abarea-Dori derivative, would effectively vanish from the commutator relationship.
So we'd lose that fundamental quantum fuzziness.
You'd lose the fuzziness. The wave-particle duality would look very different. Quantization effects might disappear. Essentially, all the weirdness linked to that non-commutation would evaporate. We'd be left purely with classical mechanics.
That the world would just be classical.
Exactly. Setting bar to 0 in the quantum equations is basically the mathematical switch that flips the universe back to the deterministic, predictable, classical physics picture. That tiny, tiny constant door is the difference between the classical world and the quantum reality we actually live in.
A very powerful thought indeed. Think about that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the language and structure of quantum operators. As Feynman shows, the logic is demanding, but incredibly revealing.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening.
We'll catch you next time.